My daughter-in-law leaned in toward me while the boat moved steadily across the open water, her voice low enough that only I could hear it, and she said something so calmly cruel that my breath caught before my mind could react. And when I turned to look at my son, my only child, Michael Whitman, he didn't speak, didn't object, didn't even look startled. He simply stood there watching the sea as if nothing important had just been decided. And in that instant, I understood exactly what they believed. That I would not be coming back from this trip, and that whatever I left behind, my home, my savings, my life, would finally be theirs. If this story sounds unsettling, stay with me, and if you've ever felt quietly dismissed by the people you trusted most, take a moment to listen closely, because nothing about what happened next was loud or sudden, but it was deliberate from the very beginning. Before that day, I would have told you that I was used to being overlooked, that I had adjusted to the polite distance that slowly replaces affection when people decide you are no longer central to their lives, and I would have said it without bitterness, as if acceptance were the same thing as peace. My name is Patricia Whitman, and by the time this happened, I had already learned how to make myself smaller in rooms where I once belonged, how to speak only when spoken to, how to interpret silence as neutrality instead of rejection. I told myself that this was just how families changed over time, that love didn't disappear, it simply learned to express itself differently. Michael hadn't always been this distant. I remembered the boy who used to call me from college just to tell me about his day, the man who once asked my opinion before making decisions. But after he married Claire, something shifted, not dramatically, not all at once, but steadily, like erosion you don't notice until the land is already gone. Claire became the organizer, the interpreter, the one who decided what was practical and what was unnecessary. And gradually I found myself included less often, consulted only when convenient, tolerated rather than welcomed. So when Michael called me himself that morning, not texting, not passing the responsibility to Claire, I felt that familiar, dangerous flicker of hope rise in my chest before I could stop it. He said they wanted to take me out on the water, just a short family trip, nothing strenuous, nothing to worry about. He said it would be good to spend time together. He didn't say he missed me. He didn't ask how I was feeling. He spoke carefully, as though reading from a version of himself that had already practiced the conversation. After the call ended, I stood alone in my kitchen, staring at the counter where my husband used to sit every morning with his coffee, and I wondered why invitations like this felt heavier than refusals. Loneliness has a way of making you grateful for attention even when it comes wrapped in uncertainty, and I told myself not to be suspicious, not to turn a simple outing into something darker than it needed to be. That morning, I dressed with intention rather than excitement, choosing clothes that made me feel steady, familiar to myself, and as I fastened a bracelet my husband once gave me without occasion, I caught my reflection in the mirror and studied it the way others had begun to, looking not for strength, but for signs of decline. It struck me then how often older women are assessed rather than seen, evaluated rather than heard, and how easily concern can be used as a disguise. At the marina, the boat waited for us, clean and impressive, the kind of thing meant to signal success without explanation. Michael greeted me with a brief hug that didn't linger, and Claire smiled politely, already distracted by details that didn't include me. When I stepped aboard, the ground shifted beneath my feet, and I remember thinking how trust often begins with something as simple as leaving solid ground behind. As we moved away from shore, conversation stayed light, controlled, almost rehearsed. Claire spoke about plans and schedules, Michael nodded along, and I listened more than I spoke, noticing how often they exchanged glances that excluded me, how rarely my presence shaped the direction of the conversation. Eventually, the questions began gentle on the surface, wrapped in concern about my comfort, my arrangements, my future. Claire watched my responses closely, not like a daughter-in-law worried about my well-being, but like someone measuring how cooperative I might be. Michael said very little, and somehow his silence felt heavier than anything Claire said aloud. The water stretched endlessly around us, calm and indifferent, and I realized then that betrayal doesn't usually announce itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as care, counting on your desire to keep the peace. When Claire leaned closer to me and lowered her voice, when she said what she said without urgency or anger, just certainty, I turned instinctively to my son, searching his face for hesitation, for doubt, for something human. He didn't look back, he just watched. And standing there with the shore already fading behind us, I understood that this trip had never been about family or healing or time together at all. It was about what would remain after I was no longer part of the picture. I didn't react right away after Claire leaned back from me, after her words settled into the space between us like something already agreed upon, because shock doesn't always arrive as panic. Sometimes it arrives as stillness, the kind that makes you acutely aware of your own breathing, of the way the boat hummed beneath my feet, of how ordinary everything looked for a moment that had quietly split my life in two. I remember thinking that if I moved too quickly, if I spoke too loudly, I might confirm whatever version of me they were already prepared to believe, confused, emotional, difficult, and I wasn't ready to give them that satisfaction. Michael remained where he was, hands resting on the railing, eyes fixed on the water, and that was when the truth landed harder than anything Claire had said. This wasn't something she was doing to him, or even for him, it was something they had already decided together, long before I stepped onto that boat. His silence wasn't uncertainty. It was permission. I watched the back of my son, the same boy whose scraped knees I used to clean, whose nightmares I once sat through in the dark, and I realized how little people warn you about the moment when your child stops seeing you as a person and starts seeing you as a problem that needs managing. The conversation shifted after that, not dramatically, but deliberately. Claire returned to her seat, her tone light again, almost cheerful, as if the most important thing had already been said and everything else was just maintenance. She talked about timing, about how the tide would change soon, about how peaceful it was out there once you were far enough from shore. Michael nodded along, adding comments that sounded supportive without saying anything meaningful. I sat quietly, listening not just to their words, but to the rhythm of them, to the way they spoke as though the outcome was already settled. I tried to remember when I had stopped being included in decisions about my own life. It hadn't happened all at once. It never does. It starts with small suggestions, gentle corrections, someone else taking over because it's easier, until one day you realize you're being consulted after the fact, if at all. I thought about the paperwork they had insisted on helping me with months earlier, the appointments Claire had offered to schedule, the way Michael had reassured me it was just temporary, just until things were simpler. At the time, I had been grateful. Now, sitting there with the open water stretching endlessly around us, I saw the pattern clearly enough to feel embarrassed that I hadn't seen it sooner. When I finally spoke, my voice surprised me with how steady it sounded. I asked Michael if we were heading back soon, not because I expected honesty, but because I wanted to hear how he would answer. He hesitated for just a fraction of a second before telling me there was no rush, that we had plenty of time, that I should relax. He didn't look at me when he said it. Claire did. Her eyes held mine for a moment longer than necessary, and in that look was something unmistakable, not anger, not cruelty, but certainty. The kind of certainty people have when they believe they are about to win. The air felt different then. Heavier, not because anything dramatic was happening, but because nothing was. The boat moved steadily forward. The water remained calm. No one raised their voice. And yet I was acutely aware that I was farther from safety than I had been in years, not just from land, but from the version of family I had once trusted without question. I thought about how many times I had defended Michael to friends who hinted that he seemed distant, how often I had told myself that love doesn't always look the same as it used to. Claire stood and moved closer again, this time positioning herself in a way that blocked part of my path without appearing to do so. She spoke softly, reasonably, explaining that they were only concerned about my future, that they wanted to make sure everything was handled responsibly, that accidents happened all the time, especially when people underestimated their limits. She said it the way one might comment on the weather, as though it were a neutral fact rather than a warning. I felt something settle in my chest then, not fear exactly, but resolve. If this was how they planned to proceed, I would not give them the reaction they expected. I looked again at Michael, searching his face for something, regret, hesitation, even guilt, but all I saw was distance. Emotional distance is a strange thing. It allows people to participate in harm without feeling like they're doing anything at all. In that moment, I understood that whatever happened next would not be an accident in the way people like to define accidents. It would be the result of a series of choices, each one made quietly enough to avoid responsibility. The boat slowed slightly, the engine adjusting its rhythm, and I noticed how far the shoreline had receded, how unfamiliar the horizon looked. I thought about how often older women are told to be agreeable, to be grateful, to avoid making scenes, and how that conditioning can become dangerous when someone decides your compliance is more valuable than your safety. I shifted my weight carefully, aware of every movement, aware too of how quickly circumstances could be framed in ways that did not favor me. Claire's hand brushed my arm, not roughly, not forcefully, but the contact was intentional, guiding rather than touching, and in that small gesture I understood something important. They weren't counting on strength or violence. They were counting on my hesitation, my reluctance to disrupt, my lifelong habit of choosing peace over confrontation. Michael still hadn't moved, he still hadn't said my name. I remember thinking then that if I survived this, whatever this turned out to be, I would never again mistake silence for love. The water lapped gently against the side of the boat, the sound almost soothing, and I realized how easy it would be for a story to be written without me in it, how easily concern could replace accountability, how quickly absence could be explained away. And as Claire leaned closer once more, her voice steady, her expression composed, I understood that the moment they believed would end me was only just beginning to reveal who they really were. And somewhere beneath that understanding, quieter but no less certain, was the realization that I would not disappear as easily as they expected. The moment didn't break open all at once. It narrowed, like the world deciding how small it could make itself before something had to give. And I remember thinking with an almost detached clarity that this was the part people never talk about, the space between knowing you're in danger and understanding what that danger will actually look like. The boat continued forward at an unhurried pace, the engine steady, the water calm, and nothing about the scene would have suggested urgency to an outside observer, which I suspect was exactly the point. Claire shifted closer again, her movements careful, measured, as if she were adjusting furniture rather than guiding a person, and she spoke in the same even tone she'd used all morning, explaining that I should hold onto the railing, that the water could be unpredictable, that it was easy to lose your balance when you weren't paying attention. She said it like advice, like concern, and Michael still hadn't moved. I looked at him then, really looked at him, searching for something I could recognize, some flicker of the boy he had been, some trace of hesitation. But his face was closed in a way I hadn't seen before, not angry, not cruel, just absent, as if he had already stepped out of the moment and left his body behind to finish the task. That was when I understood that whatever happened next would not be undone by reason or appeal. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a decision already carried out in his mind. The wind picked up slightly, lifting strands of hair from my face, and I became acutely aware of my footing, of how the deck dipped almost imperceptibly beneath me, of how much my safety depended on cooperation I no longer trusted. I shifted my weight slowly, carefully, refusing to rush, refusing to give them a moment they could later describe as confusion or clumsiness. If this was going to happen, I wanted to be present for it, fully aware of the choices being made around me. Claire's hand came to rest at my back, not forceful, not aggressive, but firm enough to guide, and she leaned in again, close enough that I could smell her perfume, clean and expensive, the kind chosen to suggest control. She said my name softly, the way people do when they want to appear kind, and told me it would all be over soon, that I wouldn't feel a thing, that this was for the best. Not just for them, she implied, but for everyone. I didn't respond, I didn't plead, I didn't argue. I turned my head slightly, just enough to look at Michael one last time, and I said his name quietly, not as an accusation, but as an invitation for him to step back into himself, to remember who he was before silence became easier than responsibility. He didn't answer, he didn't even meet my eyes. That was the moment the last piece settled into place. The movement that followed was not dramatic. There was no shove that sent me flying, no sudden violence that would make for a clear story later. It was a shift of pressure, a calculated loss of balance, the kind of thing that could be explained away in a sentence if someone needed to. The railing slipped from my grasp, the deck tilted, and the sky seemed to widen above me as the boat continued forward without slowing. The water was colder than I expected. Shockingly so. It stole my breath before fear could catch up, wrapped around me with a weight that made every movement feel slower, heavier, as though time itself had thickened. I remember the sound more than anything, the sudden absence of the engine's hum replaced by a deep, muffled quiet, and the way my body reacted before my thoughts did, kicking, reaching, fighting to surface. When I broke through the water, gasping, my hair plastered to my face, I saw the boat already pulling away, its shape growing smaller with every second. For one brief moment, Michael turned. Our eyes met across the distance, and I waited for a signal, for doubt, for something, but the boat did not slow and he did not call out. Claire didn't look back at all. That was when the understanding hit me fully, not as panic but as grief. They were leaving, not by accident, not in confusion. They were leaving because they believed this was finished. The water tugged at my clothes, heavy and insistent, and I focused on staying afloat, on breathing, on keeping my movements deliberate rather than frantic. I thought about how many stories are shaped by what people expect to find at the end of them, and how easily absence becomes proof when no one is looking too closely. I told myself to stay calm because calm was the one thing they had not planned for. My arms burned. My legs ached. But I stayed above water long enough to spot it, a small fishing boat in the distance, moving slowly, methodically, the kind of vessel that doesn't belong to anyone in a hurry. I raised one arm, then another, waving with more determination than strength, not knowing if I'd been seen, only knowing that stopping wasn't an option. Time stretched again, each second heavy, uncertain, until the boat changed course just slightly, and I felt something shift inside me, not relief, not yet, but possibility. As it drew closer, I could make out a figure at the helm, a man watching the water with the kind of attention that comes from years of knowing how easily it can take what isn't careful. When hands finally reached for me, rough and steady, pulling me from the water with a strength that felt almost unreal, I realized how close I had come to becoming a story told by other people, shaped by their words instead of my truth. The man, Thomas Reed, as I would later learn, wrapped a blanket around my shoulders without asking questions, his movements efficient, his expression serious but not alarmed. "Easy," he said, as if steadiness were something that could be shared. "You're safe now?" "Safe." The word felt strange, provisional, but I held on to it as the boat turned away from the open water, as the horizon shifted again, as warmth slowly returned to my hands. I knew then that surviving was only the first part of what lay ahead. Being found did not mean being finished. Because somewhere behind us, a boat was heading back to shore carrying two people who believed they had erased me, and I was already beginning to understand the quiet power of letting them keep that belief just a little while longer. I didn't tell Thomas Reed everything right away, not because I didn't trust him, but because survival has a way of making you cautious about who gets the full truth and when. And as I sat wrapped in a coarse blanket that smelled faintly of salt and engine oil, feeling sensation slowly return to my hands, I watched his face instead, lined, focused. The face of someone who had learned long ago not to ask unnecessary questions while the situation was still unfolding. He steered the boat with practiced ease, glancing at me often enough to make sure I was still conscious, but not so often that it felt invasive, and I realized how rare that kind of attentiveness was, the kind that protects without hovering. When he finally spoke again, it wasn't to demand an explanation, but to offer a choice. He asked if I wanted him to radio for help. The question landed heavier than it should have, because help would mean attention, and attention would mean questions, and questions would mean that Michael and Claire would learn far too soon that I was still alive. I asked Thomas to wait. He studied me for a moment, not skeptically, not judgmentally, but thoughtfully, as though weighing something beyond rules and procedures, and then he nodded once, the decision made without ceremony. He told me we'd head toward a quieter dock, one he used when the weather turned unpredictable, and I understood then that this was a man who knew when silence was not avoidance but protection. As the boat moved steadily forward, warmth slowly settling back into my body, I stared out at the water I had just been pulled from and felt the first true wave of something break over me. Not fear, not anger, but grief. Not for what had almost happened, but for what had already been lost. You don't stop loving your child just because they betray you. You mourn them while they're still alive, and that kind of grief is disorienting in ways people rarely prepare you for. I told Thomas my name then, Patricia Whitman, and watched his expression shift almost imperceptibly as recognition dawned. He had heard it before. Not in the context of scandal or tragedy, but in passing, in conversations about families who owned boats like the one that had just left me behind, families whose lives unfolded far from the edges of the water where men like him made their living. He didn't say anything about it. He simply adjusted his grip on the wheel and told me we'd be on land soon. The dock we approached was quiet, tucked away from the main marina, bordered by low buildings that looked more functional than welcoming, and when Thomas helped me step onto solid ground, I felt the strange vertigo that comes with realizing how close you came to never standing there at all. He led me to a small office nearby where an older woman sat behind a desk, sorting paperwork with the calm efficiency of someone who had seen many kinds of emergencies and learned not to dramatize any of them. Her name was Mrs. Alvarez, and she took one look at me, soaked, shivering, wrapped in a borrowed blanket, and rose from her chair without asking a single question that mattered. She brought me dry clothes from a back room, made me sit, handed me a cup of something warm, and told me gently that whatever had happened could wait until my hands stopped shaking. There was a kindness in that restraint that felt almost overwhelming. As I changed and warmed, the reality of my situation settled more firmly into place. Michael and Claire would return to shore soon. They would tell a story. It would be a careful story, shaped by concern and regret, one that explained my absence without assigning blame. They would appear shaken, perhaps even grieving, and people would believe them because belief is easier than suspicion, especially when the alternative is too uncomfortable to consider. By the time they finished telling it, I would already be missing. Mrs. Alvarez asked, gently, if there was someone she should call for me, and for the first time since the boat disappeared from view, I allowed myself to consider the weight of that question. There were people I could call, friends, acquaintances, professionals, but every call would create a trail, and every trail would lead back to Michael and Claire far sooner than I was ready for. I told her there was no one, not yet, and she accepted that answer without pressing. As the afternoon wore on, Thomas checked in quietly, making sure I was steady, making sure I understood where I was and what options I had. He didn't offer advice. He didn't try to fix anything. He simply stayed present, and I realized how grounding that was, how different it felt from the kind of attention that seeks control rather than care. Sitting there, wrapped in borrowed clothes, sipping something warm, I began to understand the strange advantage of my situation. As far as Michael and Claire knew, I was gone. They would grieve publicly. They would plan privately. And they would move quickly because people who act out of entitlement rarely wait longer than necessary. That night, Mrs. Alvarez offered me a small room above the office. Nothing luxurious, nothing permanent, just a place to rest where no one would be looking for me. As I lay there, listening to the quiet hum of the building settling, I thought about how many decisions in my life had been made to keep others comfortable, to avoid conflict, to preserve a version of peace that required my silence. That peace was gone now. And as sleep finally began to claim me, I made a decision that felt heavier than any I had made before, not out of vengeance, not out of anger, but out of clarity. I would let Michael and Claire believe their version of events for now. I would give them the quiet they expected. And in that quiet, I would learn exactly what they did once they thought I was no longer there to stop them. Because when people think they've won, they stop hiding who they really are, and I intended to be listening when they showed me. The strange thing about being presumed gone is how quiet the world becomes around you, as if your absence has already been accepted before anyone bothers to question it. And when I woke the next morning in the small room above Mrs. Alvarez's office, it took me a few seconds to remember why that quiet felt so heavy, why no one was calling my name or knocking at my door. And then the memory returned all at once, not the fall, not the water, but Michael's silence, which somehow hurt more than anything else. Mrs. Alvarez brought me coffee without asking how I took it, a small kindness that made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. And as I sat at the narrow table by the window watching the street slowly come to life, I realized something unsettling. This was the first morning in a very long time that no one expected anything from me. No explanations, no compromises, no emotional labor disguised as family duty. The thought was both freeing and deeply sad. Thomas stopped by later that morning to check on me, his presence steady and unintrusive, and when he asked if I'd decided what to do next, I surprised myself by answering honestly. I told him I wasn't ready to be found. Not yet. He didn't ask why. He simply nodded and said that people rarely think clearly when they believe they're being watched, but they reveal everything when they think they're alone. That sentence stayed with me long after he left. By midday, the news had begun to take shape, and Mrs. Alvarez showed it to me on a small television mounted in the corner of her office. The words were careful, respectful, a concerned family, a tragic accident at sea. My name spoken slowly, solemnly, as if it already belonged to the past. Michael appeared on the screen briefly, his face drawn, his voice subdued, and I felt a familiar ache in my chest, not because he was convincing, but because he was believable. People trust calm grief, they always have. Claire did not appear on camera, which told me more than her presence ever could have. She was managing things elsewhere, speaking to the right people, setting the right tone, making sure the story unfolded the way they needed it to. Watching it all from a chair I wasn't meant to be sitting in, I understood then that grief, when performed well, can become a kind of currency. As the hours passed, I began to see the shape of what came next. Calls would be made, documents reviewed, conversations held behind closed doors. Michael and Claire would move quickly not because they were heartless, but because they believed efficiency was the same thing as competence. And competence, in their minds, justified everything. That afternoon, with Mrs. Alvarez's quiet permission, I began to take stock of what still belonged to me, accounts that hadn't yet been touched, contacts I hadn't yet lost, decisions I hadn't yet surrendered. It was strange, looking at my life from the outside like that, evaluating it not as something to be maintained, but as something to be protected. I realized how much trust I had given away simply because it was easier than insisting on my own authority. What surprised me most was not the fear I felt, but the calm that followed it. Without the constant pressure to explain myself, to soften my words, to anticipate reactions, my thoughts became clearer, sharper. I could see patterns I had ignored for years, moments when concern had crossed quietly into control, when help had become leverage. None of it felt dramatic now. It felt obvious. That evening, Thomas returned with information, not speculation, not gossip, but small, concrete details. He told me Michael had contacted a lawyer that morning, that Claire had scheduled meetings for the following week, that decisions were already being framed as necessities rather than choices. I listened carefully, committing everything to memory, not because I intended to confront them, but because understanding is a form of preparation people often underestimate. When night fell, I lay awake longer than I meant to, staring at the ceiling and thinking about how many times I had stayed quiet to preserve peace, how often I had told myself that letting things go was the same as being wise. There is a difference, I realized, between forgiveness and disappearance, and I had been practicing the latter without calling it by name. Somewhere in the distance, a siren passed and faded, and I wondered how many people in the world were being spoken for at that very moment, their stories shaped by those who benefited most from their silence. The thought made something in me settle, not into anger, but into resolve. Because while Michael and Claire believed they were closing a chapter, they had no idea I was still reading. And as long as they believed I was gone, they would continue to reveal exactly who they were when no one was watching. That realization followed me into sleep, steady and certain, carrying with it a truth that would shape everything that came next. The quiet they were enjoying was temporary, and the woman they thought they had erased was already deciding how, and when, to return. The first thing I noticed, once the days began to settle into a rhythm I hadn't planned but quickly adapted to, was how quickly Michael and Claire stopped looking back. Grief, it turns out, has a shelf life when people believe there is something waiting for them on the other side of it. And as I sat in Mrs. Alvarez's small office watching the quiet routines of a place that had nothing to do with me, I realized how fast absence becomes permission when no one challenges it. Thomas came by in the early afternoon, his expression unreadable in the way of someone who had learned to deliver information without adding unnecessary weight. And he told me that Michael had been seen at my house that morning, not lingering, not reflective, but purposeful. Claire was with him. They had gone inside together. The words shouldn't have surprised me, and yet something tightened in my chest anyway, not because I missed the house, but because I recognized the tone of efficiency Thomas described. That house was no longer a memory to them. It was a resource. I asked Thomas if they had stayed long. He shook his head. Long enough to check things, long enough to make calls, long enough to start deciding what stayed and what went. That night, I lay awake imagining drawers opening, shelves being assessed, objects being weighed not for meaning but for value. And what unsettled me most was not the intrusion, but how natural it felt to them to move forward without me. The following day, Mrs. Alvarez offered to walk with me around the block. Nothing ambitious, just a way to remind my body that it still belonged to me. And as we moved slowly past storefronts and quiet corners, I felt the strange duality of being both invisible and exposed. Anyone could see me, and yet no one was looking for me. I realized how easily people pass one another without truly seeing how anonymity can be both protection and erasure. When we returned, Thomas was waiting with more news. Claire had contacted my bank, not aggressively, not improperly, just enough to ask questions framed as concern enough to signal readiness. Michael, he said, had reached out to my lawyer requesting a meeting when appropriate. The phrasing told me everything. Appropriate did not mean now, it meant when there was no one left to object. I felt a flicker of something then, not panic, not fear, but urgency. Silence had given me clarity, but it had also given them momentum. There was a balance to be struck, and I understood now that disappearing completely was not the same as preparing. I needed to be deliberate just as they were, but quieter. That afternoon, with Mrs. Alvarez's help, I made a list. Not of grievances, not of betrayals, but of facts. What I owned, who managed what, where signatures mattered, which decisions could be delayed and which could not. It felt almost clinical, stripping my life down to its framework, but there was comfort in the structure. Control returns first to the mind before it ever reaches the world. As evening settled in, Thomas returned one final time, his voice lower than before. Michael and Claire, he said, had scheduled a meeting at the house later in the week. Not with friends, not with family, with advisors, people who spoke the language of transitions. That word stayed with me long after he left, transition, as if I were already a past tense they were reorganizing around. That night, I stood at the small window of the room I had borrowed and looked out at the street below, watching strangers pass with their own lives intact, unaware of the careful erasure being planned elsewhere. I felt something settle into place then, a decision forming not out of anger but out of necessity. I could not let them shape the ending without my voice, even if my voice had to arrive softly. I wasn't ready to confront them, not yet. But I was ready to be present again in ways they would not immediately recognize. Ready to listen more closely, ready to step back into the edges of my own life without announcing myself. Because the house they were so confidently reclaiming was not empty in the way they believed. And when the time came, they were going to learn that absence does not mean surrender. And as I turned away from the window, I understood something with absolute certainty. The moment they thought they were finally in control was the moment I needed to be closest, unseen, and paying attention. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives when you stop waiting for people to do the right thing and instead begin preparing for what they are actually going to do. And by the time Thomas told me the date of Michael and Claire's meeting at the house, I no longer felt the sting of surprise, only the steady weight of inevitability. They were moving forward because, in their minds, the past had already been settled and I was part of that past. I asked Thomas to take me as close to the house as he could without drawing attention. Not inside, not yet, just close enough to see it again, to remind myself that it was real, that I was real, and that the life they were reorganizing had not dissolved simply because they stopped acknowledging it. He didn't question the request. He just nodded, the way people do when they understand that some decisions are about grounding rather than action. We parked down the street, far enough away to be unremarkable, and I sat there longer than I needed to, looking at the front of the house where Michael had grown up, where I had once believed safety was a permanent condition rather than a fragile agreement. The windows were dark, the place looked unchanged, and yet I knew better. Control doesn't announce itself. It settles in quietly, rearranging things while no one is watching. Thomas told me they'd already been inside twice since my disappearance, once briefly, once longer, each visit more confident than the last. Claire had brought folders the second time. That detail stayed with me, not the betrayal itself, but the preparation. Betrayal, I realized, is rarely impulsive. It's administrative. Back at Mrs. Alvarez's office, I spent the afternoon doing something I hadn't done in years. Speaking my intentions out loud, not defensively, not apologetically, simply stating what I knew and what I wanted. Mrs. Alvarez listened without interruption, her hands folded, her expression calm, and when I finished, she said something that landed more deeply than advice ever could. She said, "You don't owe anyone an explanation for protecting yourself." That night, I slept more deeply than I had since the boat. Not because things were resolved, but because I had stopped negotiating with denial. When morning came, it brought with it a strange steadiness, the kind that doesn't rush you forward but holds you upright. Thomas returned with news just after noon. The meeting at the house had been confirmed. Advisors, legal language. Forward motion? He didn't need to explain what that meant. I already understood. Once those conversations started, once plans were documented and roles assigned, undoing them would become harder, not impossible, but messier. Time mattered now. I told him I was ready to be seen again, but not in the way Michael and Claire would expect. I didn't want confrontation. I didn't want explanations. I wanted presence. The kind that unsettles without shouting. The kind that forces people to adjust their footing without knowing exactly why. Mrs. Alvarez helped me choose clothes that didn't draw attention but didn't erase me either, and as I looked at myself in the mirror, I noticed something had changed. I wasn't bracing anymore. I wasn't rehearsing responses or preparing to defend my emotions. I looked like someone who had already made peace with the truth and no longer needed approval to carry it. We arrived at the house just before they did. I didn't go inside right away. I waited. I listened. I watched Michael and Claire arrive together, their movements coordinated, efficient, already halfway into the future they were planning. They didn't look back at the street. They didn't hesitate. The door closed behind them without ceremony. When I finally stepped inside, it was quietly, deliberately, as though I had never left. The house smelled familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, cleaned, adjusted, prepared for a version of life that no longer included me. I took my seat in the living room, the chair I had chosen years ago because it faced the window just right, and I waited. When Michael entered the room and saw me, the sound he made was not a word. It was something smaller, something instinctive. Claire stopped behind him, her expression freezing not in fear but calculation, and in that pause I saw clearly how differently they processed the same shock. Michael looked unmoored. Claire looked cornered. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't stand. I simply looked at them and said hello. The silence that followed was thick, uncomfortable, and entirely earned. I could see Michael searching for language, for explanations that no longer fit, while Claire recalculated everything she thought she understood about control. I told them I was alive. I told them I was aware. And I told them calmly that whatever they thought they were arranging no longer applied. I didn't threaten, I didn't accuse, I stated facts about access, about authority, about boundaries that had already been reestablished while they believed I was gone. Michael tried to speak. I stopped him with a raised hand, not harshly, just firmly, and I said something that surprised even me. That I didn't need to hear why, because reasons don't undo choices. Claire asked what I wanted. The question was sharp, almost defensive, and I realized how unfamiliar it must feel to her to be uncertain again. I told her I wanted my life back quietly, without negotiation. I wanted distance. I wanted respect, and I wanted them to leave. They didn't argue, not because they agreed, but because something had shifted. The certainty they'd been operating under had collapsed, and without it there was nothing left to stand on. When the door closed behind them, the house felt different, not reclaimed, not triumphant, just honest. I sat there alone for a long time, letting the weight of what had happened settle without rushing it away. Because I knew something they didn't yet understand. This was not the end of the story. It was the moment they realized they had misjudged how quietly a woman could endure, and how firmly she could decide when she was finished being erased. What people don't tell you about moments like that, the ones where everything finally stops moving, is that they don't arrive with relief the way you expect. Instead, they leave behind a kind of stillness that asks to be understood rather than celebrated. And after Michael and Claire walked out of the house, I stayed seated for a long time, listening to the silence they had mistaken for victory only days earlier. The house didn't feel like it had been returned to me. It felt like it had been revealed. Every room held memories I had once softened to keep others comfortable, choices I had explained away because conflict seemed heavier than compromise, and sitting there alone, I realized how often I had mistaken endurance for grace. There is dignity in patience, yes, but there is also dignity in deciding when patience has been exhausted. Thomas came by later that afternoon, careful as always not to intrude on the emotional space of a moment. And when I told him they had left without argument, he nodded slowly and said something that stayed with me. People who plan quietly are always shocked when someone else does the same. He didn't stay long. He didn't need to. His role, like mine, was shifting. Over the next few days, things unfolded the way they always do once truth replaces assumption. Paperwork corrected itself. Authority returned to its rightful place. Conversations that had once been rooted around me now required my voice again, and what surprised me most was how quickly the world adjusted, not because I demanded it, but because clarity has a way of reorganizing priorities without asking permission. Michael tried to call once. I didn't answer, not out of spite but out of understanding. Some conversations don't lead to healing, they only reopen wounds that have already closed the way they needed to. Claire didn't reach out at all, which felt fitting. Control rarely apologizes, it simply retreats and looks for quieter ground. Patricia Whitman, I realized, was no longer the woman waiting to be considered. She was the woman who had learned how easily she could be written out and how firmly she could write herself back in without raising her voice. That knowledge changed the way I moved through my days, the way I spoke, the way I listened. It wasn't armor, it was alignment. Mrs. Alvarez continued to check in on me long after I no longer needed shelter, her kindness steady and unremarkable in the way real support often is. And one afternoon, as we sat together watching the street outside her office, she said something simple that felt like a benediction. "You came back to yourself." I hadn't realized how far I'd drifted until she said it. The house, in time, became a home again, not because everything was restored, but because nothing needed to be performed anymore. I rearranged rooms, let go of objects that no longer carried truth, kept the ones that did. I stopped explaining my choices to people who weren't living with their consequences. As for Michael and Claire, I learned to hold their absence the way one holds a closed door, not angrily, not mournfully, but with acceptance. Family, I discovered, is not proven by proximity or inheritance, but by the willingness to protect rather than consume. And when that willingness disappears, distance becomes a form of self-respect. The ocean still visits me in dreams sometimes, not as fear, but as memory, a reminder of how close I came to vanishing without anyone asking the right questions. I wake from those dreams calm now, grounded in the certainty that survival is not always loud, and justice does not always need witnesses to be real. If there is one thing I carry forward from all of this, it is this. Being underestimated is not a weakness when you know who you are. It is simply a momentary condition, one that ends the instant you decide to stop shrinking for the comfort of others. And if my story resonated with you, if you've ever felt quietly erased, politely dismissed, or expected to disappear so others could move forward, then I hope you'll remember this. Your presence matters, even when no one is looking. If you're still listening, thank you. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, told slowly and honestly, consider subscribing and sharing your thoughts below. Sometimes being heard is the first step toward coming back to yourself.